It is 11:47 at night, Christmas Eve. My baby is 11 days old. He is asleep on my chest, and someone is knocking on my door. 3 knocks. Hard. Certain. The kind of knock that does not ask permission. I already know who it is. The man who spent 7 years deciding who I was supposed to be. The man whose lawyers spent 8 months trying to destroy my reputation. The man whose mother knew everything and said nothing. My ex-husband, a billionaire, and he is furious. But here is the thing he does not know. He does not know that the baby on my chest, this 11-day-old, 7-pound perfect little person, is his son. I carried this pregnancy alone, through every court date, through every document with his lawyer's letterhead, through every night I sat in this apartment and counted the cracks in my ceiling just to feel something solid. I never told him, and tonight, on Christmas Eve, he is about to find out. What happens in the next few hours will change all 3 of our lives, but what no one tells you about a moment like this, the moment the door opens and everything shifts, is that the most powerful thing in the room is not the man with the money. It is the woman who already survived without him. The lesson this story carries: your silence was never weakness, it was protection. And when you are finally ready to open the door, you will open it on your own terms. Before we begin, if this story finds you at the right moment, if you have ever felt invisible in a life that looked perfect from the outside, please like this video, leave a comment below, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let me tell you what happened when I opened that door.
The knock came at 11:47. 3 sharp knocks, hard and certain, the kind of knock that does not ask permission. Caroline heard it from the nursing chair by the window. She did not move. She looked down at the small face pressed against her chest, and she breathed slowly. In, out, in. Everett was asleep. He had been asleep for 22 minutes. She knew this because she had been watching the clock on the wall above the bookshelf. The way she watched it every night, counting the minutes of quiet the way a person counts money when there isn't enough of it. 22 minutes of sleep. And then 3 knocks. The apartment smelled like pine needles, like gingerbread from that afternoon when Nora had baked in that quiet, determined way of hers. The way she did when she had feelings too large for words and needed somewhere to put her hands. The little Christmas tree on the windowsill had paper ornaments they had made together 2 days ago. Old magazines, cut into stars and bells and folded into shapes. Nora's idea. She had spread the magazines on the coffee table like she was setting up an art project, and she had said, "Come on." And Caroline had sat down, and they had cut paper for 2 hours without talking about anything important. It had been a very good afternoon, and now there were 3 knocks on the door. Caroline already knew. She had not known it would be tonight. She had not known it would be Christmas Eve of all nights when the city was emptying out and the snow was starting and every reasonable person was somewhere warm with someone they loved. But she had known it was coming. She had known that Grant Calloway would eventually find out, that he would not receive the information quietly, that when he came, he would come like this. At night, without calling, wearing the energy of a man who believed the world owed him an immediate explanation. She had just not known it would be tonight, 11 days after Everett was born. 11 days. From the hallway came the soft sound of a door, Nora's door. Then footsteps, careful and quick, and Nora appeared in the doorway of the living room in her robe, her gray braid loose over one shoulder, her face asking everything without saying a word. Caroline looked at her. "It's him," she said. Not a question. Nora's jaw tightened. Something moved across her face. 14 months of held-back opinions, of bitten lips, of things said only to Caroline's father on the phone late at night when they thought she was asleep. All of it crossed her face in about 2 seconds. Then she smoothed it away. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Caroline looked back at Everett. His hand was curled against her collarbone. His fingers were the size of her thumbnail, each one a separate, small miracle. His breathing was the steadiest thing in the room, that tiny engine turning over and over, warm and indifferent to the knock on the door and the man behind it and the 14 months of wreckage that had preceded this moment. She thought, I spent 9 months building you by myself. I carried you through every court appearance, through every document that came with his lawyer's letterhead. Through every night I sat in this chair before it was a nursing chair. When it was just a thrift store chair, I refinished by hand because I needed something to do with my anger. She thought, he does not get to knock like that. And then, quieter, the thought she had been pressing down for 11 days. He doesn't know he has a son. She stood up carefully. She settled Everett against her shoulder, one hand under his small head. She walked to the door. She opened it. Grant Calloway was standing on her doorstep. Charcoal overcoat. The good one. The one she had helped him pick out 4 years ago, at that shop in Midtown where the salesman had called him Sir so many times it became almost funny. He had been in the rain. His dark hair was wet at the temples. His jaw was set in that specific way she had spent 7 years learning to read, the way that used to make her begin apologizing before she even understood what had gone wrong. He opened his mouth. He was going to say something furious. She could see it assembled behind his eyes, every word chosen for maximum impact, the way he chose things, efficiently, deliberately, with the confidence of a man who had never been told his choices were wrong. And then he stopped, because she was holding a baby. The silence was immediate and total. Grant stared at Everett. Everett slept on, completely indifferent to being stared at by his father for the first time. Grant's mouth, which had been halfway through the first syllable of a full accusation, closed, then opened, then closed again. Caroline watched his face do something she had never seen it do in 11 years of knowing him. Grant Calloway, worth $400 million, feared by 12 boards of directors, a man who had once made a room full of lawyers go completely silent simply by standing up, looked genuinely lost. He said, very quietly, "Is that, His name is Everett," Caroline said. Her voice was steady. That surprised her. She had imagined this moment many times. In the imagining, her voice had always shaken. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." She stepped back. He came in. She watched him register the apartment the way she had always known he would. The modest couch, the second-hand bookshelves, the little Christmas tree with its paper ornaments. She watched him take in the smallness of everything, the particular modesty of a life rebuilt from almost nothing. She waited to feel ashamed. The shame did not come. She had been certain it would come. She had rehearsed for it. She had prepared, in her mind, the internal speech she would give herself. This is yours. You chose this. There is no shame in choosing a small, honest life over a large, dishonest one. But she didn't need the speech. She stood in her small apartment in her nursing clothes with her 11-day-old son on her shoulder, and she felt something she had not been able to name yet. It felt like standing on solid ground. She had not stood on solid ground in a very long time. Grant sat on the edge of the couch. He did not take off his coat. He did not stop looking at Everett, who was now making the small snuffling sounds that meant he was thinking about waking up. "How old?" Grant said. It wasn't quite a question. 11 days, Caroline said. She watched him do the math. She watched the exact moment he arrived at the answer. His face changed in a way that was almost painful to observe. Not anger, not yet. Something more fundamental. Something being rearranged. "The divorce was finalized 14 months ago," he said. "Yes." "And you were already—" "Yes." A silence. Outside, the snow was beginning. Small flakes, just starting, catching the light from the street lamp below the window. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. And here was the thing. Here was the moment she had rehearsed in her head 100 times. Lying awake in this apartment, one hand resting on her stomach, listening to the city settle into its nighttime sounds, she had prepared answers, several of them, each one reasonable, each one true. But what came out of her mouth was not any of them. "Because you had already decided who I was," she said. And who I was someone who didn't matter. Grant was very still. Everett opened his eyes. He looked up at the ceiling with the focused, slightly alarmed expression of a person who has just remembered that the world is enormous. Then he turned his head, very slowly, the way newborns do, and his gaze landed somewhere in the general direction of Grant's voice. Grant made a sound. It was very small, almost nothing. But Caroline heard it. She said, "I need to feed him. I'll be right back." She went to the bedroom. She sat in the nursing chair. She looked at the ceiling. She did what she always did when the weight became too much to hold standing up. She counted the cracks in the plaster. 1, 2, 3, 4. There were 7 of them. She had counted them perhaps 200 times since moving in. 7 cracks in an old ceiling in a small apartment that was completely, entirely only hers. She breathed. She thought, "I am not going to fall apart tonight." She thought, "I have done harder things than this." She looked at Everett. She thought, "He is going to be fine. I am going to make sure of it. Even if making sure of it means walking back out there and having the conversation that will change all 3 of our lives." From the living room, she heard nothing. Grant was being very quiet. She wondered what he was doing in the silence. She wondered if he was looking at the paper ornaments. She wondered if he was counting things too. She sat with Everett for 6 minutes. Then she stood up. She squared her shoulders. She walked back out. Grant was sitting exactly where she had left him. He had, finally, taken off his coat. It was folded on the cushion beside him, which meant his hands had needed something to do. She recognized that. She had done the same thing many times, folded and refolded things when her mind was too full to be still. Nora appeared from the kitchen with 2 mugs of tea. She set one in front of Grant. She gave Caroline a look that said, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. You've got this." Then she disappeared back down the hallway. Grant looked at the mug as if he had never seen one before. Then he wrapped both hands around it. "Tell me," he said. "From the beginning, I want to understand." Caroline looked at him. That was the first time in their entire relationship, 7 years of marriage, 2 years of dating before that he had used those words. Not "tell me what happened," not "explain yourself," not "let's be rational about this." "I want to understand." She took a breath. "All right," she said, "but you're going to need to actually listen. Not wait for a pause so you can respond. Actually listen." Grant nodded. Outside, the snow fell steadily now, small and quiet, and indifferent to the 2 people inside this apartment who were about to tell each other the truth for the first time. She did not start with the affair. She started with how she had felt on their 3rd wedding anniversary. Sitting across from him at a restaurant he had chosen, wearing a dress he had suggested, at a reservation made by his assistant. She remembered looking at the candle between them and thinking, "I am a guest at my own anniversary dinner." She had not said that out loud. She had smiled. She had ordered the fish. She had listened to him talk about the Callaway Industries' quarterly numbers, because that was what he talked about when he was trying to celebrate something. He shared the thing he was proudest of, and the thing he was proudest of was his company. Always. And she had understood that this was his version of intimacy, and she had tried, for a long time, to receive it as such. But it is exhausting, receiving as intimacy something that is not meant for you. She had been exhausted for years before she admitted it. She told him this now, not with anger, with the particular flatness of a person reporting facts from a long time ago. Grant listened. His hands were still around the mug. He had the expression of a man who is hearing something he suspected, but had successfully avoided knowing. "I didn't realize," he said finally. "I know," she said. "I thought you were happy." "I was performing happy," she said. "There's a difference. And I was good enough at it that I think I fooled both of us for a while." He was quiet. She kept going. She told him about the first year of the marriage, which had been genuinely good. She was not going to pretend otherwise. The first year had been full of the particular electricity of two people who are still partly strangers, choosing each other every day. Grant had been present in that year, attentive. He had remembered small things: the name of her college roommate, the way she took her coffee, the specific kind of tired she got after big social events, when she needed an hour alone to decompress. She had loved him. She wanted to be clear about that. She had loved him fully and without reservation for at least the first 3 years. "What changed?" Grant said. It was a real question. She could tell he genuinely wanted to know. "You got bigger," she said. "The company expanded. The board got complicated. The travel increased. And I got—" She paused. "I got sorted." "Sorted." "Filed," she said. "Put in the correct category: wife, asset, signal." She looked at him steadily. "You started making decisions about my life the way you made decisions about your company, efficiently, without really consulting the person most affected." Grant's jaw worked. "I didn't do that intentionally," he said. "I know," she said. "That's one of the things that made it so hard to name." She remembered the first time she had Googled something at 2 in the morning. She had been lying in their bed, Grant asleep beside her, and she had picked up her phone under the covers and typed, "Is it normal to feel lonely in a marriage?" She had deleted the search immediately. She had felt, somehow, that the search itself was a betrayal, as if asking the question was more damning than the feeling that had prompted it. She had stared at the ceiling for a long time after that. She had thought, everyone feels like this sometimes. This is just marriage. This is just the long middle part. This is normal. She had been very good at telling herself things were normal. She had been so good at it that it had taken her 2 more years to understand that what she was doing was not acceptance. It was disappearance. She was making herself smaller and smaller to fit the shape of what the marriage needed her to be, and she had been calling it love, and it was not love. It was disappearance. "I tried to tell you," she said to Grant now. "Not directly. I was never direct enough. That's partly on me." She kept her voice even. "But I tried. There were nights when I would say something like, 'I feel like I'm invisible in this house,' and you would say, 'That doesn't make any sense.' And the conversation would end there." Grant said very quietly, "I remember one of those nights." She looked at him. "The night before your sister's wedding," he said. "You said something like that, and I told you that you were imagining it." He stopped. "I've thought about that night since then." Caroline was still. This was also unexpected. The specific memory, the admission that he had held it. "I wasn't imagining it," she said. "I know," he said. "I know that now." Outside, the snow was heavier. She could hear it against the window. Not loud, just present. A soft, continuous pressure. Nora reappeared silently, refilled both mugs, and disappeared again. This was remarkable, Caroline thought. Her mother had never once been able to resist contributing to a difficult conversation. The fact that she was staying silent in the hallway was an act of profound restraint and love. "I want to ask you something," Caroline said. Grant looked at her. "When did the marriage stop being real for you?" she said. "Not the divorce, not the paperwork, the actual marriage. When did it stop feeling real?" He thought about it. She had not expected him to actually think about it. She had expected deflection, or a pivot to logistics. or the particular kind of reasonableness that was really just distance in a suit. Instead, he sat with the question for almost a full minute. "I think," he said slowly, "it stopped being real when I stopped being afraid of losing you." She looked at him. "In the beginning," he said, "I was aware that you could leave, that you were your own person, and you were choosing me, and you could choose differently. That kept me present." He stopped. "At some point, I stopped feeling that. I started assuming." He looked at the mug. "I stopped choosing you every day. I just assumed you were there." She thought, "That might be the most honest thing you have ever said." She thought, "I wish you had said it 2 years ago." She thought, "I wish I had asked the question 2 years ago." "We both stopped paying attention," she said. "That's the truth. I stopped speaking clearly. You stopped listening carefully. And the gap between us got wider, very slowly, the way those things do, until one day I looked across the room at you and I thought, I don't know who you are anymore. And I'm not sure you know who I am at all." Grant's hands tightened on the mug. "And then," she said, "there was Delia." The name fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Grant said nothing. Caroline said nothing. Everett made a small sound and shifted against her chest. "I'm going to tell you what I knew and when I knew it," she said. "And I need you to just listen. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. She believed him. That was the strange thing about this night. She believed him for the first time in years. Something had broken open in him when he saw Everett. Something that had been sealed shut and armored over was now at least partially exposed. She did not know what to do with that yet, but she believed him. She began. She started with the photograph, not because it was the worst thing. It wasn't. It was the smallest thing, in some ways. A photograph between two folders in a home office, a woman she didn't know, laughing on the deck of a boat she recognized. But it was the first thing. And first things matter. They are the place where a different choice could have been made. "I found it on a Tuesday afternoon," she said. "You had asked me to organize your home office before a client visit. I was going through the files on the desk, and it was between two folders, just sitting there." Grant's face was very still. "A woman," she said. "Dark hair, standing on the Margaret, laughing." A pause. "When was this, Fimpum?" he said. "About 2 years into the marriage," she said. "I stood there holding it for a long time, and then I put it back." "You put it back." "I put it back," she said. "And I told myself it was nothing. Someone else's photo, misfiled. A friend." I had 17 explanations before I finished walking to the kitchen. She looked at him steadily. "I was already fluent in explaining things away," she said. "You didn't teach me that. I came to the marriage already knowing how to do it. But you gave me a lot of opportunities to practice." Grant looked at the floor. He did not deflect. He did not explain. He just looked at the floor and absorbed it. She kept going. She told him about the months that followed, how the photograph never quite left her mind, how she would be doing something completely ordinary, unloading the dishwasher, walking to the dry cleaner, sitting in traffic. And that image would surface. The woman laughing, the comfortable posture, the ease of someone who knows exactly where she belongs. She had Googled Grant's name during those months. She hated admitting this. It felt humiliating, sitting in her kitchen with her coffee going cold, typing her own husband's name into a search bar and scanning the results for something she both wanted and dreaded to find. She had found nothing, which should have reassured her. It did not reassure her, because the feeling was still there, underneath everything, like a low hum in a room where you can't identify the source. She could tell herself it was imagination. She could tell herself she was being irrational. She could repeat over and over that she had no evidence, that a photograph was not proof of anything, that she was a woman with a pattern of catastrophizing. She had been in therapy briefly, 2 years before the marriage ended. She had told the therapist about the hum. The therapist had said, "What does your body tell you?" She had said, "My body thinks something is wrong." The therapist had said, "And what does your mind say?" She had said, "My mind says I'm probably overreacting." The therapist had said, "Which voice do you usually listen to?" She had known the answer. She had not said it out loud. She told Grant this now. "I spent years," she said, "listening to the voice that told me I was probably overreacting. That voice sounded so reasonable. It had such good arguments." She paused. "It told me that marriages go through phases. It told me that successful men travel and have complicated lives. And that's not betrayal. That's just ambition. It told me that I had chosen this, and I should be grateful." Grant said, "Who told you to be grateful?" "Your mother," she said. More than once. A silence. "I know," he said. "She told me that women who marry into families, like yours, make adjustments," Caroline said. She said it kindly. She was always kind about it. But the message was clear. My discomfort was an adjustment I hadn't made yet. Not a signal worth listening to. She stopped. She breathed. In, out. She thought, "I am not going to cry. I am not going to give this apartment the wrong sound on Christmas Eve." She did not cry. She kept going. She told him about the folder. 2 months before the divorce filing, she had been looking for the car insurance documents. A minor accident, a scratched bumper, nothing serious. She had gone to the filing cabinet in the study, the one that held their joint documents. She had found a folder she had not seen before. Inside, a lease agreement. An apartment on the Upper East Side. Grant's name was not on the lease, but she knew his handwriting. Tucked behind the lease, a single note. 4 words in his hand. "I'll take care of it." She stood in the study for a very long time. She did not show it to anyone. Not Bethany, not her mother, not Tom Waverly, who was already drafting paperwork for the divorce she had not yet decided to file. She put the folder back. She went to the kitchen. She sat at the island, and she looked at the garden through the window, and she thought, "So there it is." Not in the dramatic way she had always imagined a revelation would come. Not with shattering glass or raised voices. Just a folder in a cabinet. 4 words in a familiar hand. A stone dropping into still water. The ripples spreading outward. She had done something then that she had not done in years. She cried. Not frantically, not with her whole body, just steadily, quietly, the way water finds its level. She had cried because it wasn't even anger she felt, sitting on that kitchen stool. Or not only anger. She felt the relief of putting down something very heavy. She had been holding that weight for so long. She had been holding it and calling it doubt, and calling it imagination, and calling it overreaction, and calling it adjustment. And it had been none of those things. It had been the truth, and the truth had weight, and she had been carrying it alone for 2 years. She set it down in that kitchen on that afternoon. She wiped her face. She opened the refrigerator. She took out the chicken and leek soup from 2 nights ago. Her grandmother's recipe, the one from the Nebraska kitchen, the one that smelled like Sunday mornings, and church bells 2 streets over, and every sensible woman in her family who had done hard things and kept going. She heated the soup on the stove. She ate it standing at the counter, looking out at the garden. She thought about her grandmother, about the way she used to say, carelessly, "A person can survive almost anything if they have something warm in their stomach and a direction to face." She survived that afternoon by eating soup, by facing the kitchen window, by deciding quietly and without drama that she was done. She told Grant all of this now. She told it in the order it happened, without embellishment and without softening. She kept her voice level. She watched his face as she spoke, and she watched it change, not with the particular expressiveness of a man defending himself, but with the particular stillness of a man receiving something true. "What was her name?" she said, when she had finished. Grant looked at his hands. It doesn't matter now, he said. I'm not asking because it matters, she said. I'm asking because I spent 2 years telling myself I was imagining things, and I would like to know if I was. A long pause. Delia, he said. The name landed in the air between them. She had known, somehow, that it would be a simple name, a plain American name, nothing exotic, just a name like any other name belonging to a real person who had made real choices. She nodded once. How long? She said. On and off, he said. For about a year. Before the divorce. On and off. For about a year. She did the arithmetic. She watched herself do it. She noted the specific way a confirmed thing can still hit differently than a suspected thing, even when you have been suspecting it for 2 years. Is she why you agreed to the divorce so quickly? Caroline asked. Partly, he said. Just that word. Partly, she thought. That is a more honest answer than I expected. She thought, I'm not sure what to do with your honesty at this particular moment, Grant. She kept her face still. She kept breathing. I knew. I knew the whole time. Not her name, not the apartment, not the specifics, but I knew. And the knowing sat in my body like a stone in a shoe, small enough to walk through every woe, too constant to ever forget. I wasn't crazy. I was just willing myself not to see, because seeing it would have meant doing something about it, and doing something about it would have meant letting go of everything I had built my life around. That is the truth. That is the whole truth. I am not the only victim of my own silence. She did not say all of this out loud, but she thought it, clearly, without flinching. That was new. That was 14 months of new. There's something I need to tell you, Grant said. His voice had changed. It had dropped into a register she had not heard before. Not the boardroom register, low and authoritative. Not the dinner party register, smooth and practiced. Something underneath both of those. Something she thought might be the actual voice of the man, with all the performance stripped away. She looked at him. Delia is gone, he said. She ended things in August. He paused. It wasn't what I thought it was. It turned out to be exactly what I deserved. He stopped again. I say that not to make you feel better. I say it because it's true. Caroline was quiet. I've spent the last 6 months trying to understand what I did, he said. To you, to our marriage. He looked at his hands. I haven't been doing a good job of it. She said nothing. She was watching his face, and she was thinking about all the times in their marriage when he had come home late and she had been asleep, or pretending to be asleep, lying still with her breathing regulated and her eyes closed, because she could not face another evening of careful conversation that communicated nothing. She was thinking about all the things she had not said because the cost of saying them had seemed too high, the relationship capital she had not had to spend. The words that had backed up behind her teeth for years until they became a pressure she could no longer ignore. Your mother knew, Grant said. Caroline went very still. She knew about Delia, he said, before the divorce. I didn't tell her. She found out. She has ways of finding things out. He paused. She knew, and she chose to protect the family's name. She looked at him. Your mother, she said slowly, knew that your husband was having an affair, and she decided to let the marriage continue rather than address it. Yes. And the 8 months of your lawyers suggesting I had hidden assets was partly her direction, he said. I didn't know that at the time. I found out in September. The silence in the room had genuine weight. She stood up. She set Everett carefully in the bassinet near the couch. She had carried it out to the living room. She always kept him close. He went everywhere she went, and she walked to the window. Snow was falling harder now. The street below was nearly empty. Christmas Eve, getting later. the city pulling itself inward. She stood with her back to Grant, and she breathed. She said, without turning, "I want to be very clear about something." "All right," he said. "I am not angry at you the way I was when the divorce was happening," she said. "I have done 14 months of work on that anger. It has mostly turned into something quieter." She paused. "But what you are describing, your mother deliberately allowing our marriage to be destroyed by a lie she could have named, that is something I will need time to process." "I understand," he said. "And I need you to hear this," she said, turning to face him. "Whatever happens next, regarding Everett, it goes through me. It goes through Tom Waverly if it needs to be formal. It will not go through your mother. It will not go through your family's legal team. It goes through me." Grant said, "Yes, I hear you." She looked at him. She studied his face. She was looking for the thing she had learned to look for in the last 2 years of their marriage. The slight tension at the corner of his jaw. That meant he was agreeing with his mouth while his mind was already working a different angle. The particular smoothness that meant a negotiation rather than a concession. She did not see it. What she saw instead was something rarer. Something she had almost never seen in 11 years of knowing Grant Calloway. She saw a man who was not managing the situation. She saw a man who was just in it. "I am not the woman I was when we got married. I am not even the woman I was when we divorced." That woman was still apologizing for taking up space. That woman had learned to read the weather in his face before she had learned to read her own feelings. She flinched at his silences and interpreted his moods and adjusted herself accordingly, constantly, the way a compass needle adjusts to magnetic north. "I don't flinch anymore. I won't apologize for that." From the hallway came the sound of Nora's door opening again. Nora appeared. She had changed out of her robe. She was wearing slacks and her good dark cardigan, the one she saved for occasions she considered significant. She had been awake the entire time. She looked at Grant with an expression that was perfectly civil and contained no warmth whatsoever. "Grant," she said. "Mrs. Hensley," he said. "It's good to see you." This was perhaps the least accurate thing he had said all evening. Nora said, "My daughter carried a pregnancy alone through a divorce. She went into labor 11 days ago with no one in that hospital room except me and her doctor. She has managed everything, by herself, with more grace than most people could manage." She stopped. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty. It's making me feel guilty," Grant said. "Good," Nora said. Then she walked to the kitchen. Grant looked at Caroline. Caroline looked back at him. And something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not with a declaration or a resolution, just a small, quiet shift. The way things shift when two people have finally run out of performance and are left with only what is actual. "Can I hold him?" Grant asked. He was looking at the bassinet. Caroline looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the reasons to say no. The practical reasons, the protective reasons, the reasons that had to do with protecting the small, sovereign territory of her life and her son from the complicated gravitational pull of this man and his family and his $400 million. She thought about Everett. She thought about the person she wanted her son to know his father was capable of being, even if his father had not yet become that person. She went to the bassinet. She picked up her son. She brought him to Grant. And she watched Grant Calloway hold a baby for the first time. He was terrible at it. His arms were rigid. He was holding Everett the way you hold something valuable and unfamiliar. Carefully, at a slight distance from the body, with the focused anxiety of a man who is very aware he might do something wrong. But his face was extraordinary. She looked away. She walked back to the window. The snow was coming harder now. The street below was completely empty. Christmas Eve, nearly 1 in the morning, the city holding its breath. She let him have a moment. She did not owe him this moment. She gave it anyway, because Everett deserved a father who knew him. And that started now, in this apartment, on this night, with Grant Calloway holding his son like a man afraid of dropping something irreplaceable, which was, she thought, perhaps exactly the right way to hold him. "Tell me about the birth," Grant said. She turned from the window. He was still holding Everett. He had gotten slightly better was at it, be it in the last 15 minutes. His arms had softened a fraction. He was still too tense, but he was learning the specific weight of the child, and she could see him adjusting to it. "You want to know," she said. "I want to know everything I missed," he said. "If you'll tell me." She sat back down across from him. She thought about whether to tell it. Some things, she had decided long ago, were not his to receive, the private victories, the specific texture of the hard nights, the things she had built inside herself in the 14 months since the divorce. But this was his too, in a way. This was the story of how his son arrived in the world. That was not something she could reasonably keep to herself. She began, December 11th. She had been alone in the apartment. Nora was coming from Connecticut the next morning. They had coordinated carefully. The due date was still 2 weeks away. There was a plan. She had been eating toast at 7:30 in the evening. Toast and a documentary about national parks, which was the kind of peaceful, undemanding thing she had discovered she loved in her new life. No one else's preferences to accommodate. Just toast and national parks and the quiet of an apartment that smelled like her things. She had stood up to put her plate in the sink, and she had felt something that was unmistakably, immediately, without any possibility of misinterpretation. This is it. She stood at the kitchen sink. She breathed. She thought, okay, I knew this was coming. I have a bag. I have the number. I have the plan. She called the hospital. She called Nora. Nora said, "I'm leaving right now." And Caroline could hear her already moving, already pulling on her coat, already reaching for her keys. She called Bethany, who was in Boston for a work conference. "I'm driving down right now," Bethany said before Caroline had finished the sentence. "Do not let that baby arrive before I get there." "You're 2 hours away," Caroline said. "2 hours is nothing," Bethany said. "I'll speed." "Please do not speed," Caroline said. "I cannot manage worrying about you and also this." Then she called a car. She picked up her bag from the closet. She had packed it at 32 weeks. Everything organized, everything labeled, everything exactly where it needed to be. This was one of the things she had done in the pregnancy that had made Nora smile in that particular way. The way that meant you're going to be a very good mother, even if your coping mechanisms are sometimes elaborate. The car arrived in 4 minutes. The driver was named Kevin, according to the app. Kevin looked at her in the rearview mirror when she got in, registered the situation immediately, and said, "Ma'am, are you—" She said, "Hospital, please," in a voice that communicated the full scope of urgency without being impolite. Kevin turned the car around without another word. He got her there in 31 minutes. She tipped him extremely well. The hospital was bright and loud with that particular December night frequency, not chaotic, but heightened. A lot of people, a lot of light, a lot of the specific busyness of a place that does not pause for holidays. She checked in. She was taken to a room. She changed into the gown and sat on the edge of the bed, and she thought, with the particular honesty that very strong physical sensation produces, the thought she had been successfully avoiding for 9 months. "I cannot believe I am doing this alone." And then Nora arrived, still in her coat, still slightly out of breath, from the parking garage, her braid coming undone at the left side. She had driven from Connecticut in under 90 minutes, which meant she had not obeyed any posted speed limits. She walked in and she looked at Caroline and she said, "I've got you." 2 words, "I've got you." Caroline started crying, not from the pain, or not only from the pain, from the simple, staggering relief of not being alone. She had been alone for so long. Not lonely, alone. There is a difference. Lonely is a feeling, alone is a fact. And she had managed the fact of her aloneness with great competence for 14 months. And she was proud of that, and she did not regret any of it. But here in this hospital room, with her mother's coat still cold from the outside air, she let herself feel, just for a moment, how very tired she was. Nora held her hand. For 8 hours, Nora held her hand. Not Nora's voice, though it was present throughout. Not Nora's face, though it was in front of her for every difficult minute. The hand, the specific, steady, unbroken pressure of her mother's hand. At some point around hour 6, she had thought, with the clarity that extreme exhaustion sometimes produces, a person can survive almost anything if someone is holding their hand. Dr. Sloan was on call that night. Dr. Sloan was in her late 40s, with short gray hair and reading glasses that lived pushed up on her forehead. She had been Caroline's OB since the 3rd month of the pregnancy. She knew the whole situation. The divorce, the solo parenthood, the complete absence of a partner in any of this. And she had never once treated Caroline as a tragedy in progress. She treated her like a woman doing something hard and doing it competently. Caroline had never properly thanked her for that. "You're doing beautifully," Dr. Sloan said, somewhere around hour 7. "This baby is ready to meet you." "Then why?" Caroline said, through the specific particular teeth-clenching discomfort of late labor, "is he being so slow?" "He's thorough," Dr. Sloan said. "You'll appreciate that quality later." Despite everything, Caroline had laughed. Everett Thomas Hensley arrived at 4:17 in the morning. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. She had given him her maiden name. She had made that decision at 22 weeks, and she had not wavered from it. He was red and furious and absolutely, completely, entirely perfect. He cried immediately, with great conviction. The sound of it. She cannot describe the sound of it. There are no adequate words for the specific way a sound can rearrange you from the inside. She had read about this moment in 3 different books during the pregnancy. She had been told about it by her mother and by Bethany and by 2 women in her prenatal class and by Dr. Sloan. None of it had prepared her. You cannot be prepared for it. You can only receive it. She looked at her son, and she thought something she had not thought in a very long time, something she had lost the habit of, somewhere in the long middle of her marriage and the harder middle of its end. She thought, "I am enough. Not I will be enough. Not I am trying to be enough. Not I hope, someday, to become enough. I am." Present tense, certain. She told Grant all of this. She told it quietly, holding her son, watching his face. Grant was very still by the time she finished. Everett had fallen asleep again, still in Grant's arms. Grant had stopped looking like a man holding a document and started looking like something else, something she did not have a ready word for. "I should have been there," Grant said. "You didn't know," she said. "I should have been the kind of man you could have told," he said. She looked at him. That was the most self-aware thing he had said to her in 11 years. She did not tell him that. She had no desire to manage his emotions tonight. His realizations were his to have. She was not responsible for guiding him through them, but she noted it. She filed it away in the place where she kept things that mattered. The conversation went quiet for a while. Not uncomfortably, just quiet, the way things go quiet when 2 people have said the most important things and need to let them settle. Grant was still holding Everett. He had gotten better at it, she noticed. His arms had relaxed. He had shifted the baby slightly, settling him more naturally against his chest, and Everett had adjusted in that boneless, total way of sleeping newborns. The small head against the expensive overcoat, the tiny fist near the monogrammed cuff. She watched this. She was not sure what she felt watching it. Something complicated. Several feelings occupying the same space at the same time, the way rooms sometimes have two temperatures, cold near the window, warm near the lamp. "What do you want?" she asked, not unkindly, but directly. Grant looked up at her. "I want to be his father," he said. "I want to be present." "Define present," she said. "I don't know yet," he said. She had expected him to have an answer. He always had answers. He was a man whose entire professional identity was built on having answers, on arriving at meetings, already knowing the outcome, on making decisions with the speed and confidence of someone who has never seriously doubted his own judgment. "I don't know yet." "Neither do I," she said. "But we're going to have to figure it out." "I know," he said. "There will be an agreement," she said. "Something formal, something Tom looks at before we shake hands. I'm not doing this on goodwill alone." "I wouldn't expect you to," he said. "I want you in his life," she said. "I want to be very clear about that, because I know it might not seem obvious, given everything." She paused. "He deserves to know his father, even a father who has things to figure out." Grant looked at Everett. "I have a lot to figure out," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "You do." A pause. "Was there anything," Grant said, "that I did right?" The question was so unexpected that she almost laughed. "Yes," she said. "Several things." He waited. "You were brilliant," she said, "and you let me be near that brilliance. In the early years, being next to the way your mind works made my own work better. I don't give you credit for that enough, even in my own head." She looked at him steadily. "You were never cruel. That sounds like a low bar, but I have known women for whom it was not a low bar at all." He nodded slowly. "And you loved me," she said, "in the wrong shape, imperfectly, in ways that I needed more than you were able to give. But I believe it was real." "It was," he said, very quietly. "I know," she said. She thought about the night she had signed the divorce papers. She had gone home to this apartment. She had already been here 3 weeks by then. She had not waited, had not negotiated for the house, had just found this place and moved into it with 2 suitcases and her grandmother's soup recipe. And she had sat on the bare floor. The apartment had been completely empty then. No furniture, no curtains. Just her, on the bare floor, with a glass of wine and her phone. She had looked at her contacts. She had scrolled past his name. Her thumb had hovered for a moment, not long, just a moment. Then she had called Bethany. Bethany had come within 40 minutes, carrying champagne and the largest pizza Caroline had ever seen. And she had walked in and set both things down and said, very firmly, "We are celebrating freedom tonight. We are not mourning the prison." Caroline had cried anyway. Bethany had sat on the bare floor with her and let her. Then they had eaten the pizza. She did not tell Grant this story. Some things were not for him. The version of me that would have called him is the version I was at 25, open, unguarded, still believing that love, if it was real enough, could bridge any distance. The version that called Bethany instead is the version the marriage made. Careful, self-contained, practiced at protecting anything tender from exposure. I am trying to become a third version. Someone who can be open again, on her own terms, in her own time. Not because someone needs her to be, not because the alternative is worse, because she has decided to. I am not there yet. But Everett makes me want to get there. "I think," Carolyn said, "you should go home." Grant looked up. "It's nearly 2 in the morning," she said. "It's Christmas Day. and we've said a great deal tonight. I think we both need time with what we've said before we say more." Grant nodded. He stood up slowly, carefully, so as not to disturb Everett. He held the baby for one more moment. Then he brought him to Caroline. She took him. She felt the specific warmth of the small body passing from one set of arms to another. And she held her son, and she watched Grant Calloway pick up his coat from the cushion where he had folded it. He put it on. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the knob. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me in, for telling me the truth." "The truth was always there," she said. "One of us had to say it, eventually." He nodded. He opened the door. He stepped out into the hallway. She listened to the elevator open and close and carry him away. Then she sat down in the nursing chair by the window, and she held her son, and she watched the snow fall on Christmas morning, and she breathed. In, out, in. The 3 weeks after Everett's birth were the hardest things she had done. They were also the most unexpectedly beautiful. She had not anticipated this. She had prepared for hard. She had read the books and attended the classes and made the lists and stocked the freezer and set up the bassinet and organized the tiny clothes by size in the second-hand dresser she had painted white over one long weekend in October. She had prepared for competent. She had not prepared for joy. Not the triumphant kind, not the Instagram kind, with the golden light and the serene expression and the implication that new motherhood is a series of luminous moments strung together like fairy lights. The real kind. The exhausted, bewildered, visceral kind. The kind where you are operating on 4 hours of sleep and your coffee is cold and you can't remember the last time you finished a full thought. And you look at this small person who is looking back at you with absolute, complete, undivided focus, and something in your chest does something that has no accurate name. That kind. Nora stayed. This had not been the plan. The plan was 1 week, and then back to Connecticut. But on the third day, when Caroline sat down on the kitchen floor to eat crackers because she could not manage the 6 additional steps to the table, Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at her, and said, "I'm not leaving." Caroline had not argued. She had eaten the crackers and leaned her head against the cabinet and said very quietly, "Thank you." And Nora had said, "Stop thanking me." And that had been that. Nora called her neighbor to water the plants. She took the bedroom. She instituted a system, a dry erase board on the refrigerator, color-coded, with a schedule for naps and feeding and the specific kind of logistics that prevent a person from dissolving into the pure chaos of newborn life. Caroline had looked at the dry erase board on the morning of day 4 and felt a love for her mother so fierce it was almost painful. Bethany came back on the first weekend. She arrived with food in quantities that implied she believed Caroline was running a small shelter. Lasagna. 2 kinds of soup. Cut fruit in a container. Brownies, because Bethany had a firm and lifelong conviction that brownies were medicine. She set everything on the counter and then looked at the dry erase board. "Nora," she said, "that board is a masterpiece. I want you to run my life. I would need considerably more information before agreeing to that," Nora said. "That's very fair," Bethany said. Carolyn, sitting in the nursing chair with Everett, laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in 11 days. It came out slightly unpracticed, like a door that hasn't been opened in a while. But it was real. It was fully real. She could feel it returning from wherever it had been. She got back to work in week 3. Not full capacity. She was a freelance graphic designer, and she had built that practice in the 14 months since the divorce from nearly nothing, taking small projects and building a portfolio and learning, slowly, that she was significantly better at her work when she was doing it for herself than she had ever been when she was doing it as the hobby career of a billionaire's wife. She took 2 small projects in Everett's first month. She worked during nap times. She sat at her desk by the window while her son slept in the bassinet 3 feet away. And she made things, and the making of things felt like the truest version of herself. She drank a great deal of coffee. She was not suffering. This was the remarkable thing. She had braced for suffering. She had prepared mentally for the particular darkness she had read about. The isolation, the depletion, the groundlessness of a new parent without a partner. She was tired. She was genuinely, structurally tired in a way that lived in her bones. But she was not suffering. She reorganized the linen closet at 2 in the morning. This was the 3rd time that week she had done something unnecessary and organizational in the middle of the night. The week before, it had been the pantry. The week before that, she had alphabetized her books and then immediately unalphabetized them and sorted them by color instead, because the color system felt more emotionally satisfying. Bethany, informed of the color-sorted books, had said, "You know that's a coping mechanism." "I know," Caroline had said, "but the shelf looks incredible." Standing at the linen closet at 2 in the morning, folding Everett's small blankets into precise thirds, she thought, "I am not doing this gracefully. I am not the composed, serene version of a woman managing difficulty. I am doing it in the way of a person finding footing on terrain they have never walked before. One foot, then the other. That is enough. That has always been enough." The phone rang early one Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the Christmas Eve visit. The number was a Connecticut area code she didn't recognize. She answered. Warren Calloway said, "Caroline, I hope this isn't a bad time." She sat down at the kitchen table. "Warren," she said, "how did you get this number?" "Bethany," he said. "I convinced her, though through a combination of sincere apology and mild begging." Caroline looked at the window. "What do you want?" she said. "About to apologize," he said without preamble. "Not to explain, not to make myself feel better. To actually apologize for something I actually did." She waited. "I knew Grant wasn't happy," Warren said. "I knew the marriage was in trouble. I knew more than I pretended not to know, and I did nothing with any of it. I was so focused on keeping the family peace and keeping the business running and not getting into anything that wasn't specifically my business that I just—" He stopped. I watched everything, and I said nothing, and I told myself it wasn't my place. A silence. "Warren," she said carefully, "you are not responsible for your brother's choices." "No," he said, "but I'm responsible for mine." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about all the people who had stood at the edges of her marriage and watched. Some of them had known more than they admitted. Some of them had simply chosen comfort over honesty, the way people do, the way it is very easy to do when the honest thing would require effort and the comfortable thing requires nothing at all. She thought about whether she was angry at Warren specifically. She discovered that she was not. "Thank you for calling," she said. "It means something." "How is he?" Warren said. "The baby." "He is extraordinary," she said. "He has very strong opinions about everything, and he's 3 weeks old." Warren laughed. It was a genuine laugh. "That sounds like a Calloway," he said. "He's a Hensley," she said. A pause. "Of course," Warren said. "Right. Sorry." "He can be both," she said. "Eventually." She ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table for a moment. Then she looked at the dry erase board, and she thought, "I have difficult people in my life who are trying to become less difficult. I can work with that. I don't have to make it easy for them, but I can work with it." She poured another cup of coffee. She went back to work. The call from Judith Calloway came on a Monday. She had been expecting it. She had been expecting it the way you expect certain weather. The barometric pressure dropping, the light changing, everything in the atmosphere telling you that something is on its way. Judith Calloway had managed one of New York's most prominent families for 40 years. She was gracious in the particular way of women who understand that grace is a form of power. She was intelligent and well-dressed and had never once, in Caroline's experience, been caught without a polished answer to a difficult question. She was also a woman who had known her son was having an affair and had said nothing. "Caroline," Judith said. Her voice was warm, professionally warm, the kind of warmth that has been calibrated and maintained over decades. "I understand Grant visited you on Christmas Eve." "He did," Caroline said. She was standing at the kitchen counter. Everett was in the bassinet nearby, awake and regarding the ceiling with his habitual focused expression. She had her free hand flat on the counter, fingers spread, feeling the cool of the surface. "I hope it was productive," Judith said. The small pause before productive was exquisite. It communicated several things simultaneously. That she was being careful, that she had a destination for this conversation already selected, that she expected Caroline to understand the subtext and respond within its parameters. Caroline was done responding within parameters. "Judith," she said, "I'm going to stop you before you get to wherever you're going with this." A slight pause on the other end. "If you want a relationship with Everett," Caroline said, "that is something we can eventually discuss. But I will not have that discussion with you until you acknowledge what you did, not what you did to me. I'm past that. What you did to your son." She kept her voice entirely level. He deserved better from his mother. The silence stretched. It was a long silence, long enough that Caroline almost spoke again to fill it. She held it. She had learned to hold silences. Then Judith said, very quietly, "You're right." 4 words, nothing else. Caroline stood at the kitchen counter and looked at Everett and thought, "That is more than I expected." "I know it doesn't, Mom," Judith began. "I know it doesn't fix anything," Caroline said. "I'm not looking for fixing. I'm looking for honesty, and that was honest, so thank you." Another pause. "He's beautiful," Judith said. "Grant sent me a photo." Caroline had not known Grant had taken a photo. She thought about the moment it could have happened. Grant sitting on her couch on Christmas morning, holding Everett, while she was in the kitchen getting water, pulling out his phone for just a moment. She filed this away without comment. "He is," she agreed. "He's very beautiful. He has Grant's hands," Judith said. "Even at this age, you can see it." "Yes," Caroline said. "He does." A silence that was softer this time. "I will do better," Judith said. "I don't expect you to believe that immediately, but I will." "I'll wait to see it," Caroline said. "That's fair," Judith said. They ended the call with nothing resolved and nothing destroyed. A beginning. A thin and tentative beginning, the kind you can't trust yet, but can't entirely dismiss. She put the phone down on the counter. She looked at Everett. She thought, "Other people's guilt is not my job to manage. Not Grant's, not Judith's, not Warren's. They carry what they did. I carry what I decide to do next." The version of me that was trying to be what everyone needed would have rushed in to reassure her, would have said, "It's fine, it's all fine, I understand, let's start fresh." Would have handed her comfort she hadn't earned because conflict was uncomfortable and managing other people's discomfort was easier than sitting in the truth. I don't do that anymore. I let people sit in what they've done. I let myself sit in what I've built. Those are different rooms. She baked bread that afternoon, her grandmother's recipe, the one she had been meaning to make since she moved in, the one that takes 4 hours and needs a warm kitchen and a person with patience enough to let things rise at their own pace. Nora had gone back to Connecticut the week before. For the first time in 4 weeks, the apartment was entirely Caroline's. She measured flour into the big ceramic bowl. She measured water. She added yeast and watched it bloom in the warm water the way it always bloomed, quietly, at its own rate, indifferent to being observed. The apartment filled with the smell of bread proving. She stood at the counter and thought about her grandmother, about that Nebraska kitchen, with its particular afternoon light and the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings, about her grandmother's hands, always busy, always making something. Her grandmother had been a woman who used her hands when her heart was full, because she had grown up in a time and place where using your hands was how you said things that words couldn't quite reach. Caroline came from that. She was that. She punched down the dough. She shaped the loaf. She put it in the oven and set the timer. Then she sat at the kitchen table and she did not do anything. She did not reach for her phone. She did not open her laptop. She did not reorganize anything. She just sat. The timer ticked. The apartment smelled like bread and the last of the Christmas pine. Everett slept in the next room. This is the life I have built. This small, warm, particular life. It is not what I planned. It is not the life I was performing for 7 years. It is mine. Completely and only mine. I am not going to apologize for how good it feels. She had not expected the email. It arrived in January on a Tuesday afternoon while she was working on a logo for a small restaurant in Brooklyn. She was deep in the specific focus of design work, that state where the outside world recedes and there is only the problem in front of you and the solutions you are trying to find. And she almost missed it. Her studio email, her professional address, the one she had set up carefully in month 2 of her post-divorce life, the one printed on her business cards. The sender name was Delia Marsh. She stared at it for a long time before she opened it. The email was 6 paragraphs. The first 3 were an apology. She read them slowly. Not once, but twice. The apology was specific. It named what had happened, and it named Delia's role in what had happened, and it did not spend very much time on explanation or context, which was, Caroline knew, the harder thing to do. It is easy to apologize when the apology comes wrapped in enough explanation to diffuse it. It is much harder to apologize without immediately explaining yourself. Delia had apologized without immediately explaining herself. I knew he was married. I told myself it was complicated. I was very skilled at telling myself things were complicated when they were simply wrong. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am not expecting it. I wanted you to know that I understand now what I participated in, and I am sorry for the part of it that is mine to be sorry for. The last 3 paragraphs were something else entirely. They were about Grant, not defending him, not asking her to reconsider anything, not requesting anything at all, just telling her something, a thing Delia had seen at the end that she believed Caroline deserved to know. In September, when things ended, he talked about you, more than you would expect. He talked about an evening years ago, a dinner party at your home, a guest who had been unpleasant, and the way you handled it. He talked about how you had spent a summer learning to renovate a house in Connecticut because you wanted to know how. He talked about your laugh. I don't know what to make of the time you spent together, but I know he loved you. I think he did not know how to be a man who loved someone rather than a man who managed things. I thought you deserved to know someone else saw that. She read it 3 times. She sat with it for the rest of the day. She did not respond right away. She was not ready to respond right away. She needed to sit with it the way you sit with something that has changed the shape of a room you thought you knew. She printed it. She put it in the folder in her desk drawer, the folder that had become, without her quite planning it, the document of her year. The lease agreement she had found in Grant's study. The first sketch she had made for her studio logo on a napkin in a coffee shop at 8 in the morning, 6 days after the divorce, was finalized. The photo of Bethany at the hospital, still in her blazer, crying into the hospital gift shop flowers. She added Delia's email to the folder. Then she wrote back. 4 drafts. The first draft was too cold, the second was too generous. The third was too careful. The fourth was 3 sentences. Thank you for writing. It took real courage to send this. I wish you well. She sent it. Then she called Bethany. I got an email, she said. From who? Bethany said. Delia Marsh. A silence. I'm going to need a moment, Bethany said. Take your time, Caroline said. Another silence. Okay, Bethany said. Tell me. She told her. Bethany was quiet for a long time after. Then she said, the other woman became your ally. I wouldn't go that far, Caroline said. I would, Bethany said. She gave you something true. She didn't have to. She had every reason not to. She could have just disappeared into her life and never thought about you again. She was trying to do something right, Caroline said, after doing something wrong. People can do both, Bethany said. At the same time, in sequence, it's one of the more annoying things about people. Caroline laughed. You're wise, she said. I'm really not, Bethany said. I'm just very well read. She thought, after she hung up, about what she had felt reading Delia's email. She had expected anger, she had expected the kind of clean, clarifying fury that the idea of this woman had sometimes produced in the abstract. The other woman, the person on the other side of the secret, the name she hadn't known was Delia for a long time. She had not felt fury. She had felt something more complicated. She had felt, this is a real person who did a wrong thing and knows it. Real people are harder to hate than ideas. She had spent a lot of time hating the idea, the category, the other woman, abstract, unnamed, a shape in her imagination where her anger could live. That shape had been useful. You can hate a shape in a way that doesn't require much of you. You can maintain the shape without knowing anything about the actual person. But Delia Marsh was not a shape. She was a woman who had found Caroline's studio email address and written 6 paragraphs and spent them mostly on the hard thing. I cannot live inside hate. I've tried. It takes up too much of the space I need for other things. And I have a son who needs me to come to breakfast. I have a studio that is growing. I have a life that is genuinely not performing it good. I cannot afford hate anymore. I choose to put it down. This is not forgiveness. Forgiveness is a different thing, and it happens on its own timeline, and it is nobody else's business. This is just, I am putting down the weight, because the weight was never making me stronger. It was just making me tired. He shows up, every week. This is what she does not expect. Not the Christmas Eve conversation that she had, in some form, anticipated, not the trust papers he brings in February, that she understands, because Grant expresses care through the management of resources, and she knows how to read his language, even if she no longer speaks it as her primary one. What she does not expect is simply, he shows up. Every Tuesday afternoon, he texts first. This is new. He texts the day before, is tomorrow still good? And she replies, yes, 2 o'clock. And he arrives at 2 o'clock. Not a minute early, not a minute late. He knocks, 3 knocks, still the same knock. And she opens the door and he comes in. He sits on the floor sometimes now. This is new too. Grant Calloway sitting on her second-hand rug, Everett on a blanket in front of him, the two of them engaged in whatever constitutes a conversation between a 41-year-old man and a 2-month-old baby. Grant talks to him. She has heard him, from the kitchen, talking to Everett in a voice she has never heard him use with anyone, lower, slower, without the calibration she has always associated with his voice. She has heard him say things like, "That's a very serious expression. You have your mother's serious expression." And, "I'm going to be better at this than I've been at most things. I'm planning on it." And once, very quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon in late January, when she was in the kitchen and the apartment was still and she could hear him clearly, "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm going to make up the time." She stood in the kitchen and she looked at the dry erase board on the refrigerator. Nora's legacy, still hanging there, half the entries outdated now, but she hadn't taken it down. And she held very still. She thought, "He is talking to a baby who cannot understand him." She thought, "He is saying it anyway." She thought, "That might be the most honest thing he's ever done." He brings papers in February. He comes on a Thursday instead of a Tuesday, calls first to ask if he can come by, and when she opens the door, he is holding a folder. The kind of folder she used to see in his study, in the life that feels now like something she read about rather than lived. He sits at the kitchen table. He sets the folder in front of her. "I set up a trust for Everett." "Everett," he says. "Independent of the company, independent of my mother, independent of everything else. I want you to have Tom look at it. I'm not asking for anything in return." She looks at the folder. She looks at him. "You don't have to do this," she says. "I want to," he says. She waits for the clause, for the condition, for the but that comes after the generous gesture, the fine print that turns the gift into a negotiation. It doesn't come. "I know the difference now," he says, "between wanting something and needing to control something." He pauses. "I want to provide for him, that's all. Nothing attached." She picks up the folder. She calls Tom Waverly that afternoon. Tom calls her back the next morning. "It's generous," he said. "Unusually generous." A pause. "It's also clean. No clauses about custody arrangements or visitation leverage. No conditions about your living situation or employment. He's simply asking for nothing." "I know," she said. "You don't have to accept it," Tom said. "I know," she said again. She thought about it for a week. She thought about pride and whether her pride was worth more than Everett's security. She concluded that it was not. She thought about what accepting the trust meant and whether it meant she owed Grant something. And she concluded that it did not. A gift with no strings is a gift with no strings. She had spent years having everything framed as a transaction. She knew a genuine offer when she saw one. She accepted it. "Thank you," she told Grant on the following Tuesday. He nodded. "Thank you for not making it harder to do than it already was," he said. She had not expected that. She filed it in the same internal place where she kept the other things he had said this winter that she had not expected. Warren visits. He comes on a Saturday in March with his wife Ellen, who is warm and slightly nervous, and brings a very good bottle of wine and a stuffed elephant for Everett. They stay for 2 hours. It is easy in the way that things are easy when everyone has decided to try. Not effortless, not without some careful navigation of the territory between them, but easy enough, human enough. Warren holds Everett with the natural ease of a man who has 3 children of his own, and Everett regards him with that evaluating gaze he gives everyone, and Warren says, "He's going to be formidable." And Caroline says, "He already is," and it is, briefly and improbably, just nice. She calls her mother that evening. Nora picks up on the second ring. "How are you?" Nora says. "Really." And Caroline sits at the kitchen table in the fading March light, and she actually thinks about it. She has gotten into the habit since December of actually thinking about questions instead of reflexively answering them. It is one of the things she has learned, that you are allowed to pause before answering. That the pause is not rudeness. That the pause is just honesty being assembled. I'm tired, she says. I haven't finished a hot cup of coffee since December. My deadline for the wellness brand project is Thursday, and I haven't slept more than 5 hours in 2 months. She pauses. And, Nora prompts. And I'm happy, she says. I'm genuinely not performing it, not telling myself to be happy. Which is strange, which I wasn't sure I was allowed to be. Why wouldn't you be allowed? Nora says. I don't know, she says. I think somewhere in the last few years, I got the idea that happiness was something you had to earn or maintain or deserve. That if things had gone wrong, it was because something about you was wrong, and you had to fix it before you were allowed to feel okay. That's not how it works, Nora says. I know that now, Caroline says. Everett knows it. He doesn't earn his contentment. He just has it. And then he screams about it when it goes away, and then he has it again, Nora laughs. He's very wise, Nora says. He's 11 weeks old, Caroline says. Still, Nora says. The light in the kitchen has gone gold. The particular gold of March, late afternoon, when the sun is finally getting high enough in the sky to come in at an angle that warms things. She had forgotten this specific light. She had lived in this apartment for over a year, and she had forgotten that this was what March looked like in this kitchen. She makes a note to notice it tomorrow, and the day after that. The wellness brand project comes in on time. She presents it on a Thursday morning. She sets up her laptop at the kitchen table, positions Everett in his bouncy seat 2 feet away because there is no one to watch him, and she has long since stopped waiting for conditions to be perfect. And she runs through the deck on a video call with a team of 5 women who are all older than her and all paying very close attention. Everett is wearing the outfit with the small lemons. He is extremely awake and very interested in the ceiling light above his bouncy seat, which he has recently begun to regard as a personal friend. The presentation goes 45 minutes. She does not drop anything. She does not lose her thread. She answers every question with the particular confidence of someone who has done the work and knows the work and does not need to apologize for knowing it. At the end, the creative director says, "This is exactly what we were hoping for. This is better than what we were hoping for." She ends the call. She looks at Everett. He has fallen asleep, chin on his chest, the lemon outfit bunching slightly at the middle. She says quietly, "We did it." He does not respond. She did not expect him to. She makes tea. She drinks it while it is still hot. This is a victory. It is the first warm Saturday in March when she takes him to the park. Not a remarkable park, just the small 1-3 blocks from the apartment, with the worn green benches and the fountain that isn't running yet, because winter is technically still on the calendar, even though it no longer feels that way. There are other people today. Families, couples, a man walking a very large dog who seems delighted by everything, a group of children chasing a ball near the far fence. She finds a bench in the sun. She sits down. Everett is in the carrier on her chest, facing out, seeing the world. He is 2.5 months old, and he has recently understood that there is a very great deal to look at. He approaches this understanding with the intensity of someone who has been given an enormous amount of homework and is determined to get through it. She tips her face up to the sun. The warmth is real, not performed warmth, not the warmth of a heated house or a proper coat. The actual warmth of actual sun in March, on the first day that feels like permission. She thinks about Grant. She thinks about what it means that he shows up on Tuesdays. She is not sure yet what to call the thing that is happening between them. It is not reconciliation. She does not want reconciliation. Reconciliation would require pretending that the last 9 years went differently, and she has no desire to pretend. It is something else, something without a clean name yet, a careful, honest, interested proximity. Two people who share a child and a complicated history and are choosing, for now, to be decent to each other. She thinks that is enough for now. She thinks things can be enough for now and also open to becoming more later. And that is not a contradiction. She thinks about Nora and the dry erase board, about Bethany and the lemon brownies she brought last week, just because Bethany believes in bringing brownies the way other people believe in sending flowers. About Warren's wife, Ellen, who had held Everett with such instinctive confidence and called him sweet boy and meant it. She thinks about Dr. Sloan saying he's thorough. You'll appreciate that later. She thinks about the soup her grandmother taught her, about 7 cracks in a plaster ceiling, about the specific weight of her mother's hand, about a folder in her desk with a lease agreement and a napkin sketch and a photograph of Bethany crying into flowers, about 3 sentences. Thank you for writing. It took courage. I wish you well. A pigeon lands on the path 3 feet in front of them. It is a very ordinary pigeon, gray and round and businesslike, the way city pigeons are, unbothered by the people nearby. Everett goes absolutely still. He stares at the pigeon with his full face, with everything he has. The way he stares at the ceiling light above his bouncy seat, with that complete and undivided and slightly alarmed focus. He has never seen a pigeon before. He is having, she thinks, a significant moment. She watches him. She thinks about the photograph from Grant's office, years ago. The woman on the boat, laughing, the easy, unself-conscious posture of someone who knows exactly where she belongs. She had wanted that posture for such a long time. She had thought, when she saw it, that it belonged to someone else. That some people had it naturally, and some people spent their whole lives performing it, and she was one of the performing ones. She breathes in, the sun is warm, the pigeon ruffles its feathers. Everett makes a sound of absolute, pure outrage. She laughs. It comes out fully and without reservation. The laugh. The real kind. The kind that doesn't ask permission or worry about how it sounds. The pigeon, startled, steps sideways. Everett stares at where it was. She thinks, I know exactly where I belong. Not the Nantucket boat, not the 8-bedroom house, not the life she performed for 7 years in clothes that were someone else's idea of who she was. Here, this bench, this park, in March on the first warm day. This small person on her chest who just experienced his first pigeon and did not care for it. This city, this apartment, this work, this studio. These women who bring food and brownies and call to check in. This mother who drove 90 minutes without obeying a single speed limit. This life that she did not plan and could not have designed and would not trade. She stands up. She settles Everett in the carrier. He is still watching the area where the pigeon was, in case it comes back. She is confident he will be watching that area for some time. She starts walking home, 3 blocks, past the coffee shop where she worked for the first 3 mornings, after moving into the apartment because she needed somewhere to be that wasn't the empty apartment. Past the bookstore where she spent 2 hours once before Everett was born, just standing in the warm and reading the back covers of things and feeling, gradually, like a person again. Past the dry cleaner, where the woman behind the counter always says, "How's the baby?" and never waits for the full answer because she already knows it's fine. She walks in the sun. Everett's hand has found the edge of the carrier strap and is gripping it with the focused intensity he applies to everything. She thinks, I built this. Not Grant's version of a life. Not anyone's version of a life, but her own. I built it from a folder and a thrift store chair and a dry erase board and my grandmother's soup recipe and 7 cracks in a plaster ceiling and my best friend driving through the night and my mother holding my hand for 8 hours, and a baby who arrived 2 weeks early and was angry about it. I built it. And it is good, and I am in it. She reaches the building, she takes the elevator, she walks down the hall to her door, she unlocks it. The apartment smells like the last of the bread she baked on Wednesday, and the pine of the Christmas tree she hasn't quite taken down because Everett seems to find the lights calming, and she has decided that is a reasonable enough reason to leave a Christmas tree up in March. She takes off her shoes. She carries Everett to the nursing chair. She sits down. Outside the window, the sun is still high enough to come in at an angle and turn everything slightly gold. She looks at her son. He looks back at her. His face is very serious. She thinks, "You are going to be fine." She thinks, "We are going to be fine." Not because everything was resolved, or because all the complicated people became uncomplicated, or because the 14 months and the hard nights and the lease agreement and the photograph and all the rest of it turned out not to matter. It mattered. All of it mattered. But she is still here, sitting in a nursing chair by a window in an apartment that is completely, entirely only hers, holding the person she loves most in the world, with nowhere else she would rather be. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The light falls on them both. The city makes its quiet sounds. And Caroline Hensley, 32 years old, graphic designer, mother, woman who counted ceiling cracks and ate soup standing up and drove herself to the hospital and came out the other side, holds her son and breathes, and is, for the first time in a very long time, entirely still, entirely present, entirely herself.
There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not stand in the center of the room with its arms crossed. It does not make speeches. It does not perform. It just holds. Caroline held for a very long time. She held through a marriage that slowly made her smaller. She held through the discovery of things she had suspected and told herself she was imagining. She held through a divorce that was designed, in part, to break her. She held through a pregnancy she carried by herself, through every appointment and every waiting room, and every night she lay awake with one hand on her stomach and thought, "I don't know how I'm going to do this." And then she did it. Not gracefully, not without cost, not without nights on the kitchen floor eating crackers because she could not make it to the table, not without reorganizing the linen closet at 2 in the morning because her hands needed somewhere to go when her mind was too full. She did it anyway. And this is the thing that this story is really about. It is not about the billionaire. It is not about the affair or the divorce papers or the Christmas Eve confrontation. Those are the circumstances. They are real and they are painful and they are the kind of circumstances that test a person down to their foundation. But what the story is really about is what Caroline found at that foundation. She found that she was still there, through everything. The marriage that made her invisible, the divorce that tried to define her as someone less than she was, the pregnancy she managed alone. She was still there, still herself, still capable, still the woman who could sit across from her ex-husband at nearly 2 in the morning and speak the truth with a steady voice and not flinch. The steadiness was new, but the woman was not. The woman had always been there. She had just been buried under 7 years of becoming who someone else needed her to be. This is what happens to many of us. Not always in such dramatic circumstances, not always with a billionaire at the door on Christmas Eve, but in smaller, quieter ways. The job that asks you to shrink, the relationship that rewards your silence and punishes your voice, the family that has a role for you and becomes uncomfortable when you step outside it. We shrink. We tell ourselves it is love, compromise, maturity, adjustment, and sometimes it is those things, but sometimes, if we are honest with ourselves in the particular quiet of 2 in the morning when the world is asleep and we are counting cracks in a ceiling, it is disappearance. And disappearance, if it goes on long enough, can start to feel like who you are. The bravest thing Caroline did was not confronting Grant. The bravest thing she did was recognizing eventually that the woman she had been disappearing into was not her, and choosing, slowly, imperfectly, with crackers on the kitchen floor and soup from her grandmother's recipe and her mother's hand in hers for 8 hours, to come back, to herself, to the woman who had always been there. If you are in a season of rebuilding, if you have left something, or are thinking about leaving something, or are still in the middle of something that is slowly making you smaller, this story is for you. Rebuilding does not look the way the movies say it looks. It does not look like a montage. It does not look like a transformation scene where the music swells and the lighting shifts, and suddenly you are standing on a rooftop with the wind in your hair looking like a woman who has it all figured out. It looks like a dry erase board on a refrigerator. It looks like brownies that a friend brings for no reason. It looks like a linen closet reorganized at 2 in the morning. It looks like soup eaten standing at the counter. It looks like putting one foot in front of the other in an apartment that is small and completely yours, and breathing, just breathing, and noting that you are still here. And one morning, on the first warm day in March, maybe, or some other ordinary day that arrives without announcement, you sit in the sun with the person you love most, and a pigeon lands 3 feet away, and your baby, who has never seen a pigeon before, stares at it with his whole entire face. And you laugh. And the laugh is real. And you think, I'm still here. I built this. This is mine. And it is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. To every woman who has ever counted ceiling cracks at 2 in the morning, to every woman who has eaten soup standing up because she needed a direction to face, to every woman who has driven herself to the hospital and come out the other side, you are still here. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. The content you just heard, every word of this story, every lesson woven into it, every moment designed to make you feel seen, was researched, constructed, and carefully edited by hand, not generated carelessly, not assembled without thought, built, the way Caroline built her life, piece by piece, with intention, with the belief that the right story, told with honesty and care, can find the person who needs it most. We hope it found you today. Thank you for listening.